Let's turn today to 2 Corinthians and chapter 8. We were considering in our last study Paul's exhortation to the Corinthians to share in the abundance that God had given to them materially with the poor saints in Jerusalem. And he does not challenge them by some Old Testament command to give 10% of their income to God, but rather he says, look at Jesus Christ as your example. And we considered that in our last study. Verse 8, I'm not speaking this as a command, but verse 9, you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And this is always the way that we are to challenge Christians to give. Not by reference to an Old Testament command to tithe, but rather to the example of Jesus Christ and giving them freedom to do exactly as they feel free to do. And Paul says further, as we've seen in verse 10, that he gives his opinion, not a command, but his opinion. And he says this is for your advantage. And now that you have begun to do this, obviously the Christians in Corinth had begun to give, he says, complete it according to your ability. And then we come to verse 12, which has an application not only to the subject of giving, but to many other matters in the Christian life. It says in verse 12 that if the readiness is present, in other words, if you're willing to give a gift to God or to do something for the Lord, it is accepted by God according to what a man has and not according to what he does not have. In other words, God accepts you according to your ability to give, not according to somebody else's ability to give. If there is a desire, that is what God sees first of all. In other words, it's not the quantity that we give, but rather the attitude with which we give, which is important to God. We must remember this, because very often we think that God's impressed by large gifts. We know that Jesus, when he saw the widow put in her 2 mites, was more impressed by that because of the attitude with which that widow gave, compared to the Pharisees who gave large gifts. The same thing we see here. It is the readiness, the willingness, which God sees, and not the quantity. And as I said, this has application not only to giving, but to many other aspects of the Christian life. Very often, we may not be able to do all that we want to do for the Lord in terms of service externally. Here is a good verse to encourage people who seem to be limited by their circumstances, perhaps mothers with a number of children who are not able to move out much of their homes like many other people can. It is the willingness of your heart that God sees, and God knows the limitations that there are in your life because of your circumstances. If the willingness is there, God accepts what you offer according to your limitations. The man who has been given only 1 talent is expected by God to produce only 1 talent, whereas the person who is given 10 talents, God expects him to produce 10, according to what a person has. To whom more has been given, more will be required, and to whom less has been given, less will be required. And this is why it is foolish to compare ourselves with one another and either feel discouraged because we can't do as much as others, or feel proud because we're doing more than others. It is impossible to compare ourselves with one another because we don't know how much God has given to the others. And it is according to each person's ability that God is finally going to judge. Therefore, there is no need for discouragement. There is no room for pride. Further, he says in verse 13, he says, I'm not saying this so that other people can have an easy time, as it were, living off your charity and your goodness, and that you have a difficult time because you sacrifice and give to others, but by way of equality. It is not God's will that a Christian or a Christian worker should live at ease and comfort at the expense of another brother's sacrifice. Now, there's a lot of that going on today in Christendom, and that's quite contrary to the spirit of the New Testament. Paul says, I do not desire that other people have a cushy time at the expense of your sacrificing your money in order to help them. That's not what I mean, he says. He says, at this present time, they are in need. And your abundance, you have an abundance, and that can supply their lack and their need. And one day, you may find that you are in need, and that the turn has come for them to have an abundance, and in such a situation, their abundance will be a supply for your need, so that there can be an equality. As it is written, Paul says, in the Old Testament, this is a quotation from Exodus 16 and verse 18, where when the manna was collected by the Israelites, it was amazing to see that the one who gathered a lot greedily did not have anything left over, and the one who gathered little didn't have any lack. God was teaching them out in the wilderness not to be greedy and selfish. We have a tendency towards that in our flesh, to think in terms of ourselves, to gather much for ourselves and our family. But you'll find in the long run that it doesn't really lead to the blessing of God. He who gathered much did not have too much, and he who gathered little had no lack. If we count in terms of money, it is true that there are believers who gather much who have plenty of money, and that there are those who have little money. But when it is a question of the blessing of God, you find that the one who gathers much does not really have much more of the blessing of God, and the one who gathers little has no lack. And he uses this Old Testament quotation to say this is how it must be among believers. Jesus said, all men will know you are my disciples when you love one another. And one of the practical aspects of this love that John himself mentions in 1 John chapter 3 is that if you see your brother in need of food or clothing, and you do not help him, how can the love of God abide in you? One of the clearest manifestations of our love is in practical matters, where we can help one another when someone in the brotherhood is in financial need or lacking material things. And there we must remember how God intended it to be among his people when he gave them the manna in the wilderness. That the one who gathered much, if God has enabled you, brother or sister, to gather much financially, remember that is with the intention that you have an opportunity to share that wealth that God has enabled you to acquire with others who are in need. Of course, we need to do this in wisdom so that we don't allow people to exploit us, as mentioned in verse 13, where somebody else tries to live a cushy life at our expense. He's not catering for that. But this principle we must bear in mind. We must not think that what we have gathered is with our own ability. Just like when the people gathered the manna in the Old Testament, that manna was not produced by them. They collected it, no doubt, but it was given by God. And every believer must realize that whatever he has of material things or money, though he may collect it with his own labor and his own efforts, it is still given by God as much as that manna from heaven. And if it is given by God, it must be given with a purpose. And it is not God's will that I accumulate so much that I have no concern for that other brother who has need. The one who has gathered little should have no lack. Then we can say, why does God allow him to get little? So that you can have an opportunity to manifest the love of Christ towards that brother. That's why God allows such circumstances. So having mentioned that, he goes on to speak about the brothers who are going to come and collect this offering. He says, thanks be to God who puts the same earnestness, verse 16, on your behalf in the heart of Titus. Titus was the one who was sent by Paul along with one or two other brothers to collect this offering of the Corinthians, to pass it on to the churches in the Jerusalem area. And he says he not only accepted our appeal, but being himself very earnest, he has gone to you of his own accord. Paul says Titus is not coming just because I sent him. He is eager to serve the saints in Jerusalem. He wasn't collecting that money for himself. Remember this, Paul wasn't asking people to support him. Titus wasn't coming to take a collection for himself. He was eager to take a collection to bless others without touching one pie of it himself. That was the spirit of those apostles. They never took for themselves. They worked with their hands, Paul did, to support himself. But he was eager that Christians should seek to help one another. And Titus, having lived with Paul for so long, imbibed that same spirit. And he says here, Titus has come to you with that same earnestness and eagerness to be of service in transporting this collection of yours to the saints in Jerusalem.